In the autumn of 1912, a man named Elias Mercer accepted a position that would unravel the carefully woven silence of one of Lowell's most respected families. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, with a slight limp that appeared when the weather turned cold, and a habit of studying his surroundings before speaking. The job offer came through a notice posted at the Merrimack Street Employment Office, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper bearing the Whitmore name. It described a night watchman position at the family's residence near the old textile mill district along the Concord River. The pay was generous for the time, nearly twice what a man might earn sweeping floors at the boot cotton mills, and the duties seemed simple. Remain stationed in the upstairs corridor from dusk until dawn, ensure no one approached the attic door, and record any unusual sounds in a logbook provided by the household. The Whitmore residence stood at the eastern edge of the Acre neighborhood, a brick structure built in 1872 that had originally served as the residence of the mill superintendent before being purchased and expanded by the Whitmore family in 1885. The house was a curious hybrid, part family home and part administrative annex, connected by a covered walkway to the adjacent textile factory that the Whitmores had operated for 3 generations. By 1912, the factory had been partially converted into a document storage facility and administrative office, its looms silenced years earlier when production moved to larger facilities in Lawrence and Fall River. The house itself retained the austere dignity of industrial architecture, with tall windows framed by granite lintels, a mansard roof darkened by decades of coal smoke, and a foundation of locally quarried stone that had settled unevenly, creating subtle slopes in the floors that residents learned to navigate without thinking. Elias arrived for his interview on the first Tuesday of October, walking from his rented room on Dutton Street as the afternoon light turned the Merrimack Canal into a ribbon of copper. He was met at the side entrance by a housekeeper named Mrs. Ida Thorne, a woman in her late 50s, whose posture suggested decades of deference to wealthy employers. She led him through the ground-floor offices, past rooms filled with filing cabinets and roll-top desks, up a narrow servants' staircase to the second floor, where Arthur Whitmore waited in a study furnished with leather chairs and glass-fronted bookcases. Whitmore was 51 years old, broad-shouldered but beginning to soften around the middle, with the careful diction of a man who had attended Phillips Academy and Harvard before returning to manage the family enterprise. He studied Elias with the unhurried attention of someone accustomed to evaluating employees, asked about his military service, his familiarity with the city, his willingness to work nights without distraction. The interview lasted perhaps 20 minutes. At its conclusion, Whitmore rose, walked to a window that overlooked the walkway connecting the house to the old factory, and delivered the instruction that Elias would later recall with the clarity reserved for moments that change everything. Between nightfall and sunrise, Whitmore explained, no one was to approach the attic door at the end of the second-floor corridor. The reason was structural. The upper floor had been damaged by a roof leak years earlier, and the beams had been compromised by mold. The space contained nothing of value, only old accounting ledgers that had warped beyond usefulness, and the floor might collapse under any significant weight. The family had sealed the door rather than pay for repairs, and Whitmore's concern was that a curious servant or a visiting relative might injure themselves attempting to explore. Elias would sit in a chair placed against the wall opposite the attic door, record any sounds of shifting timber or animal infestation in the logbook, and politely redirect anyone who approached. The position had been vacant for several months, Whitmore added, and the previous watchman had left without notice, presumably finding better work elsewhere. Elias accepted the position. He had no reason to refuse. The wages would allow him to send money to his aging father in New Hampshire, and perhaps save enough to open a small repair shop of his own within a year or two. He was given a set of keys to the side entrance, a wool blanket for the colder nights, and a leather-bound logbook with his name embossed on the cover. His first shift began that Friday. The corridor was longer than it appeared in daylight, extending perhaps 40 feet from the main staircase to the attic door. The walls were covered in a faded floral wallpaper that had been fashionable 30 years earlier, now peeling at the seams and darkened in patches where roof leaks had stained the plaster beneath. Gas fixtures mounted at intervals along the ceiling provided weak illumination, their flames flickering in drafts that seemed to move through the house without any obvious source. The chair assigned to Elias was a wooden armchair with a cane seat, uncomfortable by design, unlikely to encourage sleep. Beside it stood a small table for the logbook, a fountain pen, and a railroad watch that had been provided by Whitmore, so that Elias could note the precise time of any reported sounds. At the far end of the corridor, the attic door waited, a solid panel of dark oak fitted with a heavy iron lock, its keyhole visible from even 20 feet away. The first night passed without incident. Elias arrived at 7 in the evening, exchanged brief words with Mrs. Thorne, who was preparing to retire to her quarters in the servants' wing, and settled into his chair. The house was quieter than he had expected. The old factory next door creaked occasionally as the October wind moved through its broken windows, and the radiators hissed at irregular intervals, but the corridor itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias recorded these observations in the logbook, using the precise, economical language he had learned writing supply requisitions during the war. At 6 in the morning, as the first grey light began to seep through the corridor's single window, he locked the logbook in the drawer of the hallway table, as instructed, and left by the side entrance. The city was already stirring, mill workers walking in clusters toward the Butte and the Massachusetts, their breath visible in the cold air. The second night was Thursday. Elias arrived to find the house already dark, Mrs. Thorne having retired earlier than usual with a headache. He climbed the servants' staircase, settled into his chair, opened the logbook, and listened. For the first 2 hours, nothing disturbed the stillness. The radiators clicked, the wind rattled a loose window pane somewhere on the ground floor. Then, shortly after 9, Elias heard footsteps above his head. He recorded the time. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, a measured pacing that moved from one side of the attic to the other and back again. They were not the random scurrying of rats or raccoons, which Elias knew well from his years in military encampments. They were human footsteps, barefoot or wearing soft-soled shoes, and they continued for approximately 12 minutes before stopping. Elias wrote in the logbook that he had heard movement in the attic space, possibly a person, possibly structural settling, amplified by wind. He did not believe the structural explanation, but he recorded it as a plausible alternative because the logbook was Whitmore's property, and Elias had not yet decided what kind of house he was working in. The footsteps returned on Friday. This time they were accompanied by a different sound, the slow, heavy scrape of something being dragged across the attic floor. Elias listened with his ear pressed against the corridor wall, and the vibration traveled through the plaster like a distant tremor. The dragging continued for perhaps 3 minutes, stopped for a period of silence, then resumed for another 2. He recorded the sounds as prolonged scraping from the attic, possibly furniture being moved by drafts. Again, he did not believe his own words. On Saturday, the 4th night, Elias arrived at the house already alert to the possibility that something was wrong. He performed his duties methodically, checking the ground floor windows as he had been instructed, ensuring the side door was locked behind him, climbing the stairs with careful attention to the sounds of the house. The corridor was cold that night, colder than the weather outside could explain, and the gas lamps seemed to burn lower than usual, casting shadows that pooled beneath the attic door like dark water. Elias sat in his chair, opened the logbook and waited. The footsteps began at 10:30, the same slow pacing he had heard before. Then the dragging. Then silence. Then, just after midnight, a sound he had not heard previously. A faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were lightly striking the floorboards with a fingernail. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was close, directly on the other side of the attic door. Elias rose from his chair and approached the door. He had been instructed not to open it, and he did not intend to. But he wanted to see whether the keyhole showed any light, whether there were any signs of occupancy that could be observed without breaching Whitmore's order. He knelt in the corridor, bringing his face level with the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the floorboards. The gap was perhaps half an inch wide, darkened by decades of accumulated dust. And caught in that dust, barely visible in the flickering gaslight, was a thin strip of fabric. Elias worked it free with his fingernail and held it up to the nearest lamp. It was a piece of blue cotton, roughly 2 inches long and half an inch wide, torn at one end as if it had been caught beneath the door and pulled. The fabric itself was unremarkable, the kind of material used in work dresses and aprons. But the stitching along its edge was distinctive. A small, 5-pointed star, embroidered in white thread, precise and even. The kind of embellishment that a young woman might add to her clothing to distinguish it from identical garments worn by other factory workers. Elias recognized the stitch immediately. His older sister Margaret had taught herself to embroider when she was 14. Practicing on scraps of fabric brought home from the textile mill in Manchester, New Hampshire, where she had worked after their mother died. Her signature had been the 5-pointed star, simple but perfectly executed, appearing on the collars of her dresses, the cuffs of her sleeves, the corners of the handkerchiefs she gave as Christmas gifts. She had embroidered a star on the sleeve of Elias's uniform before he shipped out for Cuba, telling him it would bring him safely home. No one else in the family had ever used that particular design. No one else had ever managed to make the points quite so even. Margaret Mercer had disappeared in the spring of 1896, 16 years earlier. She was 22 years old at the time, employed as a payroll clerk at the Whitmore Textile Company in Lowell, a position she had obtained after the Manchester Mill, where she had worked previously, reduced its workforce. The official account of her disappearance, as recorded in the Lowell police files and reported in the Lowell Sun, was that Margaret had been accused of stealing funds from the company payroll, had confessed to the theft during a private meeting with management, and had fled the city before formal charges could be filed. A letter in her handwriting, postmarked from Boston and addressed to the family home in Manchester, stated that she had left Massachusetts voluntarily and did not wish to be contacted. Elias, who had been 18 when his sister vanished, had never fully accepted that account. Margaret had been meticulous about money to the point of obsession, recording every penny she earned and spent in a small ledger she kept in her bedside drawer. She had aspired to become a bookkeeper, to rise above the factory floor, to prove that a woman could be trusted with financial responsibility. The accusation of theft did not match the sister he had known. But the police had closed the case after receiving the letter, and their father, a man worn down by grief and factory work, had accepted the official explanation with the exhausted surrender of someone who could not bear to hope. Now, 16 years later, Elias held a strip of fabric embroidered with his sister's distinctive star, found beneath a sealed attic door in the home of the family that had accused her of theft. He did not sleep that morning. He returned to his rented room at 7, laid the fabric on his bedside table, and stared at it until the noon whistles blew across the city. Elias did not confront Whitmore immediately. He had learned during the war that information gathered quietly was more valuable than accusations made publicly, and he understood that his position in the household was precarious. He was a hired watchman, a man of no social standing, and the Whitmores were among the most influential families in Lowell. If he accused them of hiding his sister in their attic without evidence beyond a scrap of fabric, he would be dismissed and discredited before he could walk to the police station. He needed more. During the days that followed, Elias began to observe the household routines with the systematic attention of a reconnaissance soldier. He learned that Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper, rose each morning at 5 and prepared a breakfast tray that she carried to the dining room where Arthur Whitmore took his meals. He learned that a cook named Mrs. Elmer Porter arrived at 7, prepared lunch and dinner, and left at 4 in the afternoon. He learned that Whitmore's wife, a woman named Clara, spent most of her days in a sitting room on the first floor, rarely venturing upstairs, and that their son, a young man of 23 named Harold, was studying law at Harvard and appeared only on occasional weekends, bringing with him the impatient energy of someone who considered Lowell beneath his ambitions. But the most significant observation occurred at the end of Elias's shifts, in the grey half-hour between 5:30 and 6 in the morning. Each day, without exception, Mrs. Thorne would emerge from the servants' staircase carrying a covered tray. The tray was not the breakfast tray she prepared for Whitmore. It was smaller, simpler, bearing a single plate, a cup, and a small brown bottle that Elias gradually identified as a medicine flask. She would walk to the base of the narrow staircase that led from the kitchen to the second floor, disappear upward for approximately 15 minutes, and return with the tray. The plate was always empty, the medicine flask was always lighter than it had been, and Mrs. Thorne always, without exception, avoided looking in Elias's direction as she passed through the corridor, as if his presence was something she had been instructed not to acknowledge. Elias consulted the household accounts during one of his shifts, having discovered that the ground-floor office where Whitmore conducted business was left unlocked after hours. The payroll records for domestic staff listed Mrs. Thorne, Mrs. Porter, and a groundskeeper named Mr. Fletcher. There was no mention of any resident in the attic. The household expense ledgers, however, contained an item that caught Elias's attention: a recurring payment of $12 per month to Dr. Calvin Reed, marked simply as Medical Services, MW. The payments had begun in 1896 and continued without interruption. There was no explanation of what MW meant, and no other medical expenses appeared in the ledgers for the same period. Dr. Calvin Reed was a name Elias recognized. He was the Whitmore family physician, an elderly man whose practice occupied a townhouse on Kirk Street, and who had served as the company doctor for the Whitmore Textile Company during its operational years. According to the Lowell City Directory, he was 71 years old in 1912, still licensed to practice, still maintaining an office, and still visiting the Whitmore residence twice each week, always entering through the side door that opened onto the covered walkway connecting the house to the old factory. The discovery of Dr. Reed's involvement shifted something in Elias's thinking. A piece of fabric might be coincidental, a covered tray might be explained by a sick relative whose existence had simply been omitted from the household records. But a family physician visiting twice weekly for 16 years, paid through the company accounts under initials that matched no known resident, was not a coincidence. It was a system. Elias returned to the household offices on subsequent nights, searching the filing cabinets and desk drawers for any document that might explain what was happening in the attic. Whitmore kept his papers meticulously organized, correspondence sorted by year, financial records bound in quarterly volumes. But in a locked drawer of his desk, which Elias opened using a thin metal file he had carried since his army days, he found a folder that had not been catalogued in the general index. It contained documents relating to an investigation conducted in the spring of 1896, the same season that Margaret had disappeared. The documents told a more complex story than the official account. The investigation had not been prompted by the theft accusation against Margaret. It had begun weeks earlier, when several female employees of the Whitmore textile mill had filed a joint complaint with the Lowell Police Department. The complaint alleged that the company had been deducting unauthorized fees from their wages, charges for equipment maintenance, breakage, and cleaning supplies that had never been agreed to in their employment contracts. The deductions amounted to roughly 15% of their pay, a significant sum for women who earned less than $5 a week. Margaret Mercer appeared in the document as a payroll clerk who had been asked to review the deductions and had discovered discrepancies between the amounts recorded in the workers' pay books and the amounts deposited in the company's accounts. The original police report was not included in the folder. In its place was a memorandum signed by Arthur Whitmore's father, a man named Josiah Whitmore, who had been the principal owner of the company in 1896. The memorandum, dated April of that year, stated that the matter has been resolved internally and that the female clerk responsible for the discrepancies has been dealt with. The phrasing was deliberate in its vagueness, a corporate euphemism that could mean anything from dismissal to something far worse. Attached to the memorandum was a receipt from a private clinic in Worcester, the Northbridge Sanitarium for Nervous Disorders. The receipt recorded the admission of a female patient on April 17, 1896, the day after Margaret's disappearance was reported. The patient's name was not given. The admitting physician was Dr. Calvin Reed. Elias copied the information into a notebook he now carried in his coat pocket, an old military field journal that he had kept as a memento of his service. He returned the documents to their folder, locked the drawer, and walked back to his room through streets that were beginning to fill with the early morning traffic of delivery wagons and mill workers. He did not sleep. He sat at his small desk, writing down everything he had learned, drawing lines of connection between the scraps of information like a cartographer mapping unfamiliar terrain. The next step was to verify the letter. The letter that Margaret had supposedly written from Boston, the letter that had convinced the police to close her case, the letter that had allowed the Whitmores to bury their involvement beneath 16 years of bureaucratic silence. Elias visited the Lowell Public Library during the afternoon, requesting access to the back issues of the Lowell Sun from 1896. The newspaper had reported Margaret's disappearance on April 18th, a brief article on the third page that described her as a former employee of the Whitmore Mill who had absconded with an undisclosed sum. A follow-up article on April 25th noted that the police had received a letter from the missing woman confirming her intention to leave Massachusetts and that the investigation had been closed accordingly. But the article contained a detail that the official narrative had never included. The letter had not been sent to the police. It had been delivered to the police station by a courier employed by Mr. Lawrence Poole, an attorney whose office was located on Central Street and whose primary client was the Whitmore family. The letter had been found, according to Mr. Poole, among papers that Margaret had left at her boarding house. It had not been authenticated by handwriting analysis. It had not been compared to known samples of Margaret's writing. It had simply been accepted. Elias searched for additional references to the case and found nothing. The newspaper had moved on to other stories. A fire in the acre, a labor dispute at the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, the death of a city councilman. Margaret Mercer had been forgotten by everyone except her family, but not, it seemed, by the Whitmores. Elias found the name Mary Wells in a different context entirely, in a bound volume of medical receipts that he discovered in a cabinet in the old factory building during the night of October 18th. The receipts had been filed by Dr. Reed's office and submitted to the Whitmore Company for reimbursement, They recorded the purchase of sedatives, specifically chloral hydrate and bromide of potassium, in quantities that suggested regular administration to a patient over a period of many years. The patient was identified as Mary Wells, and the payments for her treatment were sent to Dr. Reed's office, never to a private address or a family member. There was no Mary Wells listed in the Lowell City Directory, the birth records, or the census data that Elias was able to consult at the library. The name was a fiction, Elias understood. It was the name given to a patient who did not legally exist, a woman whose identity had been erased so that she could be held without accountability. And if the woman in the attic was Margaret, then the Whitmores had not simply covered up a fraud investigation. They had imprisoned a witness for 16 years, drugging her into compliance, erasing her from the world, and paying a doctor to certify that she was insane so that no one would believe her if she ever managed to speak. Elias sat in his chair in the corridor that night, looking at the attic door with a new and terrible understanding. His sister was on the other side of that door. She had been there for months, perhaps years, moved between the clinic and the Whitmore properties, like a piece of furniture that the family did not want but could not dispose of. And he, her brother, had been hired to guard her, to sit in this chair and record her footsteps as if they were structural settling, to ensure that no one discovered what the Whitmores had done. The storm that broke over Lowell on the night of October 23rd was one of the worst in recent memory. The Merrimack River rose dangerously, flooding the basements of buildings along the Canal District, and the wind tore branches from the elm trees that lined the residential streets. Elias arrived at the Whitmore house soaked despite his overcoat, his limp more pronounced than usual in the damp cold. The house was dark, the gas lamps extinguished by a pressure drop that had affected the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Thorne had left a single oil lamp burning on the hallway table, its flame casting trembling shadows across the corridor walls. Elias lit 2 additional lamps he found in the kitchen and carried them upstairs. The storm was loud enough that he could barely hear the creaking of the old house above the wind, and the attic door seemed to vibrate in its frame as gusts of air pushed through gaps in the roof. He settled into his chair, wrapped the wool blanket around his shoulders, and waited. Shortly after midnight, the wind died for a moment, and in that silence, Elias heard 3 distinct knocks on the other side of the attic door. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. Elias recognized the rhythm before his conscious mind understood what he was hearing. It was a signal from his childhood, a code that he and Margaret had developed when their father was drinking, and they needed to communicate without attracting his attention. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. Are you there? I am here. They had used it through the walls of their adjoining bedrooms in Manchester, tapping on the plaster with their knuckles, confirming each other's presence on nights when the house felt unsafe. Elias rose from his chair and approached the door. His hand trembled as he raised it to the wood. He knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The response came within seconds, the same pattern repeated back to him. Faster now, more urgent. And then, from the other side of the door, a voice so thin and fragile that it might have been the wind if it had not spoken his name. Eli, little brother. The voice used his childhood nickname, the name that only his family had ever called him. It was a name he had not heard spoken aloud since his father's last visit to Lowell 5 years earlier, when the old man had confused Elias with a cousin who had died in infancy and called him by the wrong name entirely. No one at the Whitmore household knew that name. No one in Lowell knew it. The only person who could have spoken it was his sister. Elias did not hesitate. He removed the metal file from his pocket, the same tool he had used to open Whitmore's desk drawer, and inserted it into the lock of the attic door. The mechanism was old, and poorly maintained, the iron corroded by years of moisture from the leaking roof. It yielded within a minute, the bolt sliding back with a rough scraping sound that was almost lost in the renewed howl of the wind. The door swung inward, revealing a space that was not, as Whitmore had claimed, a storage area filled with mouldering ledgers. It was a room. A small room, perhaps 12 feet by 10, divided by a makeshift wall constructed from salvaged planks and old shipping crates. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its mattress thin and stained. A washstand occupied the opposite corner, bearing a chipped basin and a pitcher of cloudy water. A single window, opaque with grime and partially boarded from the outside, admitted the faint glow of distant street lamps. The air was cold, damp, and carried the faint medicinal smell that Elias now associated with the brown bottle on Mrs. Thorne's tray. And in the bed, wrapped in a quilt that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible, lay a woman who was at once a stranger and the most familiar person Elias had ever seen. Margaret Mercer was 38 years old, but she looked 60. Her hair, which had been brown and thick when Elias last saw her, had thinned and greyed, pulled back in a loose braid that someone had attempted to keep neat. Her face was pale from years without sunlight, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sunken in sockets that seemed too large for her features. Her hands, resting on the quilt, were thin and veined, the knuckles prominent, the fingernails broken. She was wearing a simple cotton dress of the kind issued at the Northbridge Sanitarium, faded to an indeterminate grey, and her feet were wrapped in wool socks that had been darned repeatedly. But her eyes, when they met his, were clear. They were the same eyes that had watched him learn to walk, that had narrowed in concentration while she taught him to read, that had filled with tears when he left for the war. They were Margaret's eyes, and they recognized him without hesitation. "You came," she said. Her voice was hoarse from disuse or from the sedatives, but the words were steady. "I knew you would come. I knew if I could just reach the door." Elias knelt beside the bed and took her hand. It was cold, the fingers fragile in his grip, but she squeezed back with surprising strength. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, to demand explanations for 16 years of absence, to apologize for believing the official account even when his instincts had told him it was wrong. But the habits of military discipline reasserted themselves. They were still in the Whitmore house. Dawn was still hours away, and the priority was not understanding, but extraction. Margaret told him what she could, speaking in short sentences that she had to pause between as if the effort of forming words exhausted her. She confirmed what the documents had suggested. She had discovered the wage theft scheme in March of 1896, had compiled evidence showing that the Whitmores were deducting unauthorized fees from workers' pay and falsifying the company's accounting records to hide the discrepancy. She had attempted to bring her findings to the Lowell police, but before she could reach the station, she had been intercepted by 2 men employed by Josiah Whitmore. They had taken her to the Whitmore residence, where Dr. Calvin Reed had examined her and declared her mentally incompetent, a diagnosis that required no evidence beyond the doctor's signature and the family's influence. For the next decade, Margaret had been held at the Northbridge Sanitarium in Worcester, a private institution that catered to wealthy families who wished to confine inconvenient relatives without the scrutiny that accompanied public commitment. She was listed under the name Mary Wells, a fictional patient with no family, no history, and no rights. The sanitarium's records showed that she was being treated for nervous hysteria, a diagnosis sufficiently vague to justify indefinite confinement and the regular administration of sedatives. When the Northbridge Sanitarium closed in 1907, the Whitmores faced a problem. Margaret could not be released, but she could not be transferred to another institution without risking exposure. Arthur Whitmore, who had inherited control of the family business after his father's death, decided to bring her to the Lowell residence. The attic was converted into a makeshift room. The door was locked, and a series of night watchmen were hired to ensure that no one discovered her presence. But Margaret had more to tell. During her years of confinement, she had managed to preserve evidence that the Whitmores had not been able to destroy. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed were pages torn from the company's accounting ledgers, pages that Margaret had smuggled out of the mill on the day she was captured. The pages showed not only the wage theft scheme, but a broader pattern of corruption that extended far beyond the factory walls. The Whitmores had been making regular payments to city officials, police officers, and local merchants, buying silence and influence with the money they had stolen from their own workers. The fraud was not the work of a single dishonest family. It was a network, a system of complicity that had controlled contracts, employment, and elections in Lowell for more than 20 years. Elias understood in that moment why Arthur Whitmore had hired him. It had not been coincidence. Whitmore had known exactly who Elias was when he interviewed him. The position of night watchman had been offered not despite his connection to Margaret, but because of it. Whitmore had wanted to see whether Margaret still retained the capacity to communicate, whether she would recognize her brother and attempt to reach him. At the same time, he had transformed Elias into an unwitting participant in her imprisonment, a guard who could be implicated in the crime if he ever tried to expose it. It was a trap within a trap, a calculation so cold that Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. He did not wait for dawn. He helped Margaret down the servants' staircase, supporting her weight when her legs faltered, wrapping his overcoat around her shoulders against the cold. He retrieved the hidden ledger pages from beneath the floorboard, folding them carefully into his jacket pocket. They left through the side entrance, crossing the covered walkway into the old factory, emerging onto a side street that the storm had emptied of pedestrians and carriages. By the time the first grey light appeared over the Merrimack River, Margaret was in Elias's rented room on Dutton Street, sitting in the single armchair, drinking weak tea that he had prepared on the small stove, staring at the window as if she had forgotten that the world outside still existed. The next morning, Elias contacted a journalist named Thomas Hargrove, a reporter for the Boston Globe, who had written critically about the Whitmore family's labor practices in previous years. Hargrove was skeptical at first, accustomed to conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated accusations. But the ledger pages, the medical receipts, the memorandum signed by Josiah Whitmore, and the testimony of Margaret herself, recorded in a sworn affidavit that Elias insisted be notarized by an independent attorney, were more than enough to launch an investigation. The story broke in the Globe on November 5, 1912, under the headline, "Lowell Heiress Held Captive in Family Attic for 16 Years." The article detailed Margaret's discovery of the wage theft scheme, her forced confinement at the Northbridge Sanitarium, her transfer to the Whitmore residence, and the complicity of Dr. Calvin Reed in certifying her insanity. It published excerpts from the stolen ledger pages, showing payments to city officials whose names were still active in Lowell politics, and it described the role of Elias Mercer, the watchman who had been hired to guard his own sister, who had unraveled the conspiracy by recognizing a scrap of blue fabric with a star stitched into its edge. The consequences were immediate, but incomplete. The Whitmore Textile Company, already diminished by the shift of manufacturing to larger facilities, was placed into receivership within months. Its remaining assets seized by creditors who had finally seen the company's true financial condition. 2 city officials named in the ledger pages resigned their positions, citing health concerns rather than acknowledging the accusations against them. The police officer who had accepted the forged letter in 1896 had died in 1908, beyond the reach of investigation or accountability, but Arthur Whitmore was never convicted of any crime. His attorneys, a firm from Boston with extensive experience in protecting wealthy clients, argued that Margaret Mercer had been mentally ill, that her confinement had been a private medical matter rather than a criminal act, and that her accusations against the family were the product of her disturbed mental state. They pointed to Dr. Reed's diagnosis, to the 16 years of medical treatment documented in the receipts, to Margaret's own erratic behavior during the brief period before she was taken to Northbridge. The case never went to trial. It was settled quietly, the terms sealed by a judge who had once attended Harvard with Whitmore's father. Dr. Calvin Reed did not wait to face questioning. He closed his practice on Kirk Street in November and relocated to an undisclosed address in New York, where he lived for another 4 years before dying of a stroke in 1916. His medical license was never revoked. His role in the Whitmore conspiracy was never officially acknowledged by any medical board or legal authority. Margaret Mercer lived for 4 years after her release. She spent those years in a small house in Concord, New Hampshire, where Elias had relocated after leaving Lowell. The house had a garden, a luxury Margaret had dreamed about during her years of confinement, and she spent hours planting and tending flowers, her thin hands working the soil with the same precision she had once applied to accounting ledgers. But the damage of 16 years could not be undone by fresh air and sunlight. She was physically frail, her body weakened by years of malnutrition and sedatives, her lungs damaged by the mold that had infested the Whitmore attic. She was emotionally fragile, prone to sudden silences and unexplained tears, unable to tolerate closed doors or the sound of footsteps above her head. She never fully regained trust in other people, not even in Elias, whose devotion she acknowledged but could not quite believe in. The world had proven itself capable of erasing her once. She lived with the knowledge that it could happen again. She died on March 12, 1917, at the age of 43. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but Elias believed she had simply exhausted her reserves of will, that the effort of surviving had consumed everything she had and left nothing for living. He arranged her funeral at a small church in Concord, a service attended by 12 people, most of them strangers who had read about her case in the newspapers and felt moved to pay their respects. She was buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of town, beneath a headstone that bore her true name, not the alias that the Whitmores had tried to impose upon her. Among Margaret's personal effects, Elias found a document that she had kept hidden since her release. It was the letter that the police had presented as proof of her voluntary departure in 1896. The letter that Lawrence Poole had claimed to find among her belongings at the boarding house. The letter was written on Whitmore Company stationery, the handwriting a close but imperfect approximation of Margaret's script. On the reverse side of the paper, barely visible in faded ink, was a notation in a hand that Elias recognized from the memorandum in Whitmore's desk. The notation read, "Use the girl's handwriting and destroy the original. A.W." Begurus Elias kept the letter for 24 years. He kept it through 2 more wars, through the Great Depression, through the gradual decline of his own health. From time to time, he contacted journalists, historians, and legal aid societies, hoping that someone would take an interest in reopening the case, in holding the Whitmores accountable, in exposing the full extent of the corruption that the stolen ledger pages had only partially revealed. But the world had moved on. The Lowell of 1912 was not the Lowell of 1936 or 1941. And the crimes of the Whitmore family had faded into the comfortable obscurity that wealth and influence could always purchase. The last documented reference to Elias Mercer appeared in 1941, in the records of the Middlesex County Historical Archives. A researcher cataloguing municipal documents noted that a collection of materials relating to the Whitmore case had been deposited with the county in 1938, including a letter written by Arthur Whitmore, a set of ledger pages, and a sworn affidavit signed by Margaret Mercer. The researcher's note, dated September 19, 1941, stated that the materials had been requested for review by an unnamed party and had been removed from the archive. A subsequent inventory conducted in November of the same year found that the materials had not been returned. They were listed as missing during reorganization, a bureaucratic phrase that could mean anything from misfiling to deliberate destruction. No further trace of the documents was ever found. The Whitmore residence on the Concord River stood empty for several years after the scandal, too notorious to sell, too expensive to maintain. In 1919, it was purchased by a real estate developer who demolished the old factory and converted the house into apartments for mill supervisors. The attic was renovated, the makeshift walls torn down, the floorboards replaced. The room where Margaret had spent the final years of her captivity became a storage closet, then a bathroom, then part of a larger apartment that a young couple rented in 1952, unaware of what had happened there 40 years earlier. But the people who lived near the old Whitmore property sometimes reported unusual things. Footsteps in the corridor when no one was walking, the smell of carbolic soap and chloral hydrate in rooms that had been cleaned and repainted, a faint tapping in the walls, 3 knocks followed by 2, a pattern that no plumber or electrician could explain. The tenants dismissed these sensations as the normal creaks and odors of an old building, the overactive imaginations of people who had heard rumors about the house's history. But a few of them, the ones who stayed long enough to learn the rhythm of the place, found it difficult to sleep on stormy nights when the wind pressed against the windows and the old beams shifted in their sockets like bones settling in a grave. Elias Mercer died in 1944 at the age of 66 in a veterans' hospital in Manchester, New Hampshire. He had outlived his sister by 27 years, had served his country in 2 wars, had worked as a watchman, a clerk, a repairman, and finally as a custodian at a public school. He never married. He never spoke publicly about the Whitmore case after 1918, when a newspaper interview he had given was suppressed by legal threats from the Whitmore family's attorneys. He lived quietly, visited Margaret's grave on the anniversary of her death each year, and kept a small photograph of her on his bedside table, taken when she was 21, before the mill, before the fraud, before the attic. In the photograph, she was smiling, and the collar of her dress was embroidered with a 5-pointed star. He did not leave a will or a written account of his experiences. The documents that might have proven his sister's story had been removed from the county archive, and the people who might have corroborated his account were dead or dispersed. What remained were fragments, a scrap of blue fabric, a notebook filled with observations, a letter with a damning annotation on its reverse side. These items were found among his belongings after his death, along with the photograph of Margaret and a military field journal whose final pages contained a single sentence, written in the precise economical hand that Elias had learned during the war. The sentence read, "I sat outside her door for 4 nights before I knew she was inside, and I have never forgiven myself for the 5th. The items were catalogued by the hospital staff and placed in a storage box with the belongings of other deceased patients. In 1953, during a routine clearance of the hospital's storage room, the box was transferred to a municipal incinerator and destroyed. No record of its contents was preserved. And in Lowell, on certain October nights, when the wind blows down from the Merrimack and the old buildings along the Canal District creak with the memory of their former lives, the story is still told in fragments. It is told by historians who have pieced together the newspaper accounts and the surviving public records. It is told by the descendants of mill workers who remember their grandmothers speaking of a young woman who discovered something she was not supposed to know. It is told in bars and coffee shops, in the acre and downtown, a local legend that has no supernatural elements, but is somehow more disturbing for its plausibility, its grounding in the ordinary corruptions of money and power. The story is incomplete. The full truth of what happened to Margaret Mercer, the complete extent of the Whitmore family's crimes, the names of everyone who participated in her destruction, will never be known with certainty. What remains is the outline, the shape of an injustice that spans decades, and the image of a man sitting in a corridor, listening to footsteps above his head, not yet knowing that the person he has been hired to guard is the sister he has been mourning for 16 years. History, like memory, is selective. It preserves what powerful people want preserved and erases the rest. But sometimes, the erased things leave traces. A scrap of fabric caught under a door, a notebook hidden in a drawer, a letter with an annotation that reveals the lie. These fragments do not constitute justice, but they constitute evidence, and evidence, even when it fails to produce legal consequences, matters. It matters because it refuses to let the truth be buried completely. It matters because it says, in the face of all the forces that conspire to produce silence, someone was here, someone suffered, and someone remembered.